Today's daf we're going to be learning is Kiddushin Daf Ayin Vav. This is the daf for Shabbat. We're now going to mention here, remind us what we're up to. We had Rabbi Elazar who said cuti lo yisa cutit, and now we're trying to come up with explanations as to why this is. And we saw that there's shalosh machlokot b'davar. There's three different opinions, and we're now explaining the three opinions. So we saw Rabbi Ishmael, then we saw Rabbi Akiva. We're now in Rabbi Akiva, who said kutim gerei emetin. Okay, at the bottom of Ayin Ham a bit, kutim were real converts, and then we have to explain what the issue is. And the kohanim shenitmu b'hem kohanim ksherim hayu, and the kohanim that they put up were kohanim ksherim. Shene'emar, as it says, vayasu lahem mitzotam kohanei bamot. Rabbi Akiva used these as actual kohanim. So then, what's the problem? Okay, that's just explaining the kohanim. They were from the best of the best. So why are they forbidden? They thought the yibum only applied to a betrothed woman, and specifically if she was married and the husband died without children, there would be no obligation of yibum. My darshe, what on earth were they thinking when they said this? Well, this actually is a bit of a strange pasuk. The woman, the wife of the dead person, hachutza, who is out, should not be liish zar. Now, we usually understand this as the eshet hameh can't go outside, but has to marry someone within the family. But they say, hachtiyat v'chutza, he lo tia liish zar. The one who's on the outside, meaning she hasn't yet married in, she's the one who can't be with an ish zar. But the one who's not living outside, they think the chutza is defining the wife. The wife who is chutza, who's on the outs, can't get married until she does yibum. But one who is already in, meaning she's already married, she actually doesn't have to do yibum. And therefore, and not only that, so now we have a lo tase. So the kutim are going against this prohibition of the women who have to do yibum are actually getting married without yibum. That's just a lo tase. Usually lo tase doesn't create mamzer problems. But Rabbi Akiva l'tameh, he, if you remember, he has this unique shita. Ta'amal gesh mamzer mechayve labim. He thinks you do something against negative prohibition in the Torah, in terms of forbidden relationships, then you end up having mamzer children. Some people say it's because they weren't careful about keeping mitzvot. This is a third opinion. So we have Rabbi Ishmael, we saw yesterday. We have Rabbi Akiva about that Rabbi Ishmael, his whole basis was that they weren't actual real converts. We have Rabbi Akiva who says they're actual converts, but there's a separate problem, which is this one issue, which creates problems of mamzerim. And this other opinion says, well, they're not careful about diktukei mitzvot. They just don't keep a lot of the mitzvot. So now that we want to know man yesh omrim, who is this yesh omrim, and really what is their shita based on? Amar Rav Idi bar Avin, Rabbi Elazar. It must be Rabbi Elazar's approach to Tanya, as it says in a Braita, matzat cuti muteret, v'adam yotzei b'yedei chovato b'Pesach. You can eat the matzah of a cuti, and you can fulfill your obligation on Pesach with it. Right, your mitzvah to eat matzah. That option obviously views kutim as true Jews, and that they're careful about mitzvah. Rabbi Elazar osel. Here we have the Rabbi Elazar that we said that must be the yesh omrim, because they said, no, you can't eat their matzah because they're not careful about mitzvot. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel omel, kol mitzvah shechziku bakutim harbe medaktikim bayoter miYisrael. Okay, he has this interesting approach. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, not only does he think they keep mitzvot, but they're actually much more careful than we are, right? This is sometimes a critique of Jews. Sometimes we're not so careful about the mitzvah we're supposed to do. Outsiders who come in, they take things much more seriously. And therefore, right, they're much more careful about mitzvah. But Jews, they're not always so careful about it. But these kutim, they came, they converted, and they took it much more seriously, and therefore you can really rely on them. Ella, hachamai ein bekiin. So now what's the issue, though? What are they not bekiin about? Lefisha ein bekiin b'torah kiddushin v'gerushin. Well, they don't keep the laws of Kiddushin and Gerushin properly, which means you could have a get that they thought was a good get, and it turns out it wasn't, and then they think the woman's divorced, and then she's really married. She goes and marries someone else, has mamzerim. Or the Kiddushin. You could have a case where the Kiddushin was, they thought it wasn't a valid Kiddushin, and therefore she goes and gets married to somebody else when she's really married to this person. All sorts of problems that could come out if you're not careful about those laws, and then you can end up with mamzerim issues. So we showed the three opinions now as to why kutim, according to Rabbi Elazar, can't marry other kutim. And this is because there's a concern that within the community, there's mamzerim, either Rabbi Ishmael and his approach we saw yesterday. Today's approach we'll review. Rabbi Akiva, who says it's mamzerim because of the yibum issue, and you would have to hold that actually creates a yibum, the mamzer problem, which normally most people don't agree with him about that, but that is Rabbi Akiva, consistent with his approach. Or Rabbi Elazar, who says that they're not careful about mitzvot, and which mitzvot? Kiddushin and Gerushin, among others. Now we're going to have a few other reasons why cutim would be an issue, that they can't marry each other. Again, once you have an issue that some of them might be mamzerim and some of them aren't mamzerim, then you're going to create a problem. So now Amar Rav Nachman Amar Rav Ravua mamzer me'achoto mamzer me'eshet ach nitarvu bahem. He says there was a mamzer who married his sister among the cutim, and there was someone who married his brother's wife. And therefore, again, we know that there's mamzerim in there, and therefore it's a problem. Now, it's not so clear whether he's saying we know or just there's a concern for this. So the Gemara first thinks there's a concern for this, to which they say, "My kamashlam, what's he coming to teach us? Yesh mamzer mechayve klitut, that if someone sleeps with their sister or someone sleeps with the brother's wife, it's kids a mamzer. What do you mean? I mean, first of all, we know that, and second of all, nitnichadu. You would only have to bring one example if that's what you were trying to say." So they say, no. No, there was actually a case, two separate cases, someone who slept with the sister, someone who slept with his brother's wife. And therefore, they're specifically telling you, because of these two cases, now, right, what happens with mamzerim? Well, their children are mamzerim, their children are mamzerim. And therefore, we know that within the cuti community, there are mamzerim because of this particular situation, these two different particular situations. It could have just been one, it would have been a problem, but it happens to be there were two, and that's why they mentioned two. The Rava Amar, and Rava had a different version, that Eved v'shivcha nitarvu bahem, that there was a case where an Eved married a Jewish woman, and there was a case where a Jewish man married a Canaanite maidservant, or Canaanite female slave, and on account of that, there are mamzerim problems, to which they say, Isurim mishum shivcha. The only problem is a shivcha, because the shivcha, the children are avadim, and then if you have an Eved marrying, it's going to create a problem. So Avadim can't marry in. But, right, and then you would have to say, okay, just look in Rashi, Sur Mishum Shivcha, Tal Korcha Ovek Kochavim Be'eved Haba Aba Yisrael Havlad Kashel, Ela Shivcha Vlada Eved. In other words, he says it's only a problem in one direction. The Eved is not a problem because an Eved, or a Gentile, who has a relations with a Jewish woman, the child's actually Jewish. We know this because Jewishness follows the mother. So the child's fully Jewish. The only problem is when the shivcha is the mother. If the mother is a shivcha, then you're going to have a problem. So why are you bringing up the Eved and the shivcha? The only problem really was the shivcha, to which they say, so therefore, it should have just said the shivcha, to which they answer, again, like we answered just in the previous, they were just telling us. This went around, that there was a woman who was a cuti who married a slave, and there was a man who was a cuti who married a female slave. The female slave was the one that created the mamzer problem, or the Eved problem. But now we have an Eved. Again, you just don't know which cuti is an Eved that is allowed for marriage purposes, and which cuti is not an Eved who can't marry for marriage purposes. Here, it's not a mamzer issue, by the way. It's just an Eved issue. So anyway, that's and therefore they just told it as it happened, but not necessarily that both parts were relevant. Okay, now moving on to the Mishnah. This is a very interesting Mishnah and very relevant, because the question is, when you go to get married, how far back do they have to check? What lineage do they check? Who do they check? Your mother, your grandmother, your father's mother, your father's grandmother. How far back do we check your lineage? Why is this interesting? Well, first of all, this is interesting just in terms of, there's a big debate in this Mishnah. Are we talking about specifically for someone who wants to marry a kohen, or is it any marriage? Okay, and there's a big debate among the commentaries about this, which is interesting in of itself. We're also going to see in the Gemara that there's a different opinion, and this is actually Rabbi Meir's opinion, or at least in one possible reading, and that the rabbis actually disagree and don't think that you need to check, and you can just assume people are Jewish. This is incredibly relevant today, because when people get married, right, whether depending on where you get married, but depending on who, right, there's some sort of check as to, are you Jewish, and how do we assume you're Jewish, and on what basis do we assume that we can accept, what you say, that you're Jewish. So, in the state of Israel, there's all sorts of rules, in other places also, but the state of Israel at least has one rule which covers a huge number of people, anybody who wants to get married in Israel has to go through the Rabbanut, and they have criteria as to what you have to bring, how you have to prove, etc. So this is a very interesting, relevant issue. In other courts also, it's, the RCA has their rules, and this Beit Din has their ruls. So if you marry, first we're going to talk about if she comes from a family of kohanim. You have to check 4 mothers with 4 females along the way, which actually means really 8. What does that mean? Well, ima, you need to check the woman's mother. You need to check her grandmother, her mother's mother. Aim avi ima. Okay, now you have to check through her father. Okay, there's going to be basically 4 channels, which ends up being 8, because each one you're going to check that person and the mother of that person. So we have the woman's mother and her mother. Then we go to her father, and we have to check the father. Now we go up a generation because we're starting with the father, not with the woman herself. Her father, we have to check her father's mother and her father's grandmother, his mother's mother. Ve'em aviha. And now we have, I'm sorry, I didn't say that right. Sorry. Aim avi ima. Sorry. Then we go to the mother's father. Okay, we have the mother, and we check her mother and her mother's mother. Sorry, I'm going back to the beginning now because I got confused. Aim avi ima vi ima. Now we go to the mother of the father of the mother. In other words, we take the mother, checked her mother and her checked the mother and the mother's mother. Now we go to the mother's father, and we have to check his mother and his mother's grandmother. Okay, then we go to Aim Avia. Now we do the same thing on the father's side. We go to the mother of the father, and then his grandmother, the paternal grandmother. Then we go to Aim, in other words, the woman's great grandmother, who's on the paternal side, because we've checked the father's mother and the father's grandmother, which is the woman's great grandmother. The Aim Avi Avia. Now we go to the mother of the father's father. We go father's father, and then the father's father, we have to check his mother and his grandmother. Okay, so we basically go up, right, 2 generations, but it often goes up even more than 2 generations, because it's going to end up depending on, right, are we checking out, there's the woman's mother and her mother, that's just 2 generations. But we go to her father, we have to go up another 2, because from the father. And then when we go to the father and the mother's mother, then we have to go, or we go to the father also, the husband, right? We have to, the Aim Avia, the Aim Avi Ima. Right, the Koran actually, by the way, has a really good chart of all this. I don't know if I can open it for a minute. Just look, I'll open it and I'll show you for a minute. Found it. Okay. Here's the chart. Okay, if you can see it for a moment. Okay, so now you have, basically, you go up, right? In other words, let's see if I can show you here. Nothing like a chart to show it. So there's the father, there's her and her mother's mother. There's the father and the father's mother and grandmother. Then we have the paternal grandfather, right? We have the father's father, and then we have to go up another 2 generations there, and the same thing on the other side with the mother. Okay, so that's what we do. But now, if you notice, that chart has something in yellow also. So now we're going to get to the second part of the Mishnah. Livia v'Yisraeli mosifin aleim od echat. Okay, now, the Livia, if she's from the Levite family or Yisrael family, then we have to actually go back even 1 more generation and check her out even more. There was an assumption, I guess, that the Kohen was more already miyuchas because they were connected to kohanim. So now we go up another level, okay, which we'll explain later what that is, okay, which means whatever mother and grandmother, now you need to go up to the grandmother's mother, okay, the great grandmother. Okay, let's stop there. If someone worked in the temple on the altar, was a kohen, meaning her father, okay, you don't have to check beyond that. We know that her lineage is good, okay? If someone had someone in the family, right, if there was someone who was, let's say, the father of the mother worked in the temple, then you know that the mother's lineage is good. Min haduchan ulamala, okay, if you have people who worked in the duchan, that was where the Levites would sing and work, then also you wouldn't need to check any farther back than that. So basically it would cut off a few possible checks that we wouldn't need anymore. And the Sanhedrin, if there was someone who sat in the Sanhedrin, we're going to see in the Gemara why all these things basically preclude you from needing checks. If they were the policemen of the people, or kind of heads of the people, authority figures, or gaba'et tzedakah, or they gave out the charity, they were the charity collectors, really collectors, not giving out. Here, by the way, is the first mention that we then allow them to marry a kohen, and we don't worry that they're from some lineage that can't marry a kohen. Okay, now, again, kohen is mentioned here. It could be that that's a reference to everything in this Mishnah, that it's all only when you're talking about kohanim, who again can't marry converts, for example. So maybe you'd have to worry about converts. So these would preclude you worrying that this was a convert family, or any other of the obvious psulim, like a mamzer and all those who can't marry really anybody. Rabbi Yossi Omer, even if you were signed as an aide on the old documents in Tzipori, that would be enough. Rabbi Chanina ben Antuginus Omer, someone who was even part of the king's fleet of, the army service. It's a little bit strange. What does this mean? We're going to have to wait till the Mishnah. The Gemara is going to get to everything. We'll actually finish everything today, because we're going to finish our daf specifically at the end of this Mishnah. So the Gemara asks, I don't understand. Why are we only checking the women? Why aren't we checking the men? So they answer the following, which is a very interesting answer, right? Usually you would think because the Judaism follows the mother, but that's not what they're worried about here, because they're worried about all sorts of yichus problems that could come up. Mamzerim, which would be the father would pass it down. We're not really checking only Jewishness here. We're checking for all sorts of disqualifications. So why wouldn't you check the males also? To which they answer, very interesting answer, culturally what went on. When women argue with each other and they start fighting and they decide to curse each other out, what are they going to say? Oh, you're a whore, you slept around with this person, you slept around with that person. Okay, that's their general term, which actually in this case is not considered a bad thing. Okay, they're going to just start shouting things like that. But they're not going to say things like, oh, you're a mamzer. Oh, you come from a slave family. Oh, your lineage is messed up. It's not the general thing they talk about. So that means that if I'm a woman and I have some sort of problem with my lineage, since in general fights that wouldn't come out, well, then nobody would actually know about it or not. It would be kept secret kind of thing. And it wouldn't be something that would have come out in conversation, as opposed to when men fight with each other, they start arguing about yichlus. They say, oh, you come from a slave family. If you remember, there was a whole story with Agrippus where they insult him and they say, you come from a family of slaves. And therefore, there's an assumption that everyone at some point in their life has gotten into fights. And therefore, someone at some point can do a background check so that they have ammunition, right? This reminds me of people who go for public office, right? Everybody looks into their background. What did you do when you were 5 years old? What did you do when you were 18 years old? And what happened in college? And we search for anything we can to dig up dirt so that we have something to say against them when we're, running against them in a political race or something. So the same thing here. This is how men would argue with each other. They would bring up, something about them. So it would come out. But with women, it wouldn't come out, because when they fight, they do fight, but they talk about other stuff. They yell at each other about other things, not about things that have to do with lineage and flawed lineage. So therefore, you wouldn't know with the women, and that's why the women need checking. The men, we assume, we know everybody and what their problems are, but what their background is, because someone at some point would have dug it up and would have screamed it out to him, and everybody would then know. But then they say, Ihinami tivdok bedide. So now they say, but when she, right, this also is showing that when she goes to get married, right, she gets checked out. And then they check her out only through the women in the family, not through the men, because if there was something with the men, we would know. But why doesn't he get checked out? Why don't we make sure that he's not from flawed lineage? So they say, because they say, this obviously supports what Rav said. And this, again, might be better supported if we're talking about kohanim, that female kohanim can marry disqualified people, okay? And then it becomes clear that the question here, again, it's very unclear about this Mishnah. Are we talking only about kohanim? And then it would be male kohanim have to worry that the woman is halala, is a zona, is something. We need to find out about their lineage, right? Or is a convert, for example. Whereas a woman who's a kohenet, a bat kohen, she can marry anybody. Now, she can't marry mamzerim, so mamzerim we would have to check out. But it seems like that probably we would know about. And it's these other things that maybe we won't know as much about, and therefore it's not a problem. Okay. Now, clearly here we're talking specifically about kohanim in this section, which would then also strengthen the position that the whole Mishnah is really talking about kohanim, and not, again, this isn't about proving Jewish necessarily, even though I did connect it to that, but it's more about proving proper lineage. Rav Adabar Avatane Arba Imahot Shem Shtemesrei. Now, our Mishnah said 4 mothers, which are 8, because each one, it was also her mother. Right, so there were 4 sections you had to check, and then you had to go, right, her mother and her mother's father's mother, right? We'd have to go through the mother's father, and then, right, the mother's father's mother, and then that mother. So each time we went up a level, and then we went to the father and the father's mother, and then we went to the father's mother, and then again, went up a generation also. But he says it was 4, which is 12. And b'manitatan, in a different bright, it says Arbi Mahochem Sheshesrei. It was 4 that goes into 16, meaning we go up 4 levels. So Bishlam Rav Adabar Ava, the first option actually makes sense, turning out I'm a bet. Mokimle b'Livia u'Bat Yisrael, because the Livia and Bat Yisrael have to go up another level. And when he said 4 that's 12, he was actually talking about the next case in the Mishnah. The Mishnah just said 4 that's 8 for the Kohenet. Then it said the Livia and Yisrael, you have to go up another one. So that's the 12. But maybe the Mishnah, the Braita, which said 16, is a totally different opinion. To which they say, no, my odechat, zug echat. Perhaps they understood the Mishnah. It's not disagreeing with the Mishnah. It's saying with the Levites and the Israelite women, we had to check 1 more. What we mean by 1 more is another pair more. And then it would go up 2. That's, by the way, what this shows in the diagram, that on each one that's this color, right, there's another 2 above, and that's according to this opinion. My Amar Rav Yehuda Amar. Now we get to understanding our Mishnah, and as I said before, we're going to say that according to Rav Yehuda in the name of Rav, Zo Divrei Rabbi Meir. Our Mishnah, by the way, follows Rabbi Meir. Aval Chachamim Omrim, and you might notice there's a little bet next to this next word, which means we actually hold this way. Kol mishpachot b'chezkat ksherot hem omdot. We don't have to look into the lineage of any family unless we know otherwise. We don't need to go searching for problems. We don't need to check that people have flawed lineage or not. There's no reason to do checks. We assume, unless we know otherwise, that the family is kosher. Everything's good. To which the Gemara says, Ini, you really think that Rav said this, that the Mishnah's Rabbi Meir but Chachamim disagree? V'hama Rav Chama bar Guria Amarav, Mishnatenu k'shekule alav ir'el. Rav said, or at least is quoted by Rav Chama bar Guria, that the Mishnah is only if someone raises a question against it, which actually matches the rabbi's opinion and not Rabbi Meir. So Rabbi Yehuda said that the Mishnah is Rabbi Meir, but the rabbis disagree. Now Rav Chama doesn't really disagree in terms of the content. In the end, they all think Chachamim say there's really not a problem unless someone raises a problem. But he says that the Mishnah is actually the opinion of the rabbis, which is only if somebody starts complaining and saying, I think there's a problem here, do you have to check into it. So man de maneha lo maneha, right? And then the one who obviously then we have a machloket. Who is the Mishnah? Is the Mishnah Rabbi Meir according to Rav, or is the Mishnah the Chachamim according to Rav? Igad Amre, but some people say that actually the debate between them wasn't really a debate, and they actually agree. And it's the following: Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav, Zo Divrei Rabbi Meir v'Chachamim Olim Kol Mishpacha b'Chezkat, Kol Mishpachot b'Chezkat Kshirot Hem Omdot. So the first is the same as we saw before, which is Rav Yehuda says the Mishnah is Rabbi Meir, but the rabbis really disagree about it and don't think you need to check it all. And then Amar Rav Chama bar Guria Amar Rav, which doesn't contradict. It just says, oh, by the way, yeah, it's true the rabbis say you don't need to check, but if somebody raises an issue, then you do have to check. And then in that case, they don't actually disagree. So 2 different readings. Is there disagreement about what Rav actually says about our Mishnah, or is there no disagreement? Now we're going to go through all these cases where you don't need to check, and why don't you need to check? They would always check people before they let them work in the temple. So we can assume that if the father worked in the temple, then the daughter is obviously fine. Sheshama yoshvim miyachsei kuna miyachsei leviyah. They say at the Duchan, it's where the part where the Levites would generally stand to sing. That's where only kohanim and Leviim who their lineage was checked out would go there, and therefore, again, it was like almost like there must have been a guard at the door who made sure that nobody came in unless they had good lineage. But my time, the Tana Rav Yosef, kashem shebetim menukim b'tzedek, kach menukim mikol avon. Just like they have to be free and fully righteous, right? Only right do tzedek, justice, right? Clean from justice, meaning clean from any injustice. They're also clean from any blemish. Okay, and a blemish would be a problem in the lineage. Amar Maremar Maikra. Where do we get this from in the pasuk? Kulach yafer rayati umum embach. Okay, they use this as a reference to the court, even though it's pasuk from Shiur Shirim about the beauty of the beloved, but you have no blemish. And they say the blemish means there's no blemish, right? It's used to explain that we're talking about the Sanhedrin, and the Sanhedrin has no blemish, right? Anyone in the court. Maybe it means they're not blemished, meaning they look beautiful, right? They don't have outward noticeable blemishes. When Moshe picks out the 70 elders, he says he's told that he gets vusham imach, and you should stand there with them. Okay, they're going to stand there with you. Sorry, with you. What does it mean? With you? Imcha bedomim lecha, right? Meaning they're going to have good lineage. V'dilma mishum shechina, maybe it was just those because they were going to be exposed to the shechina and they had to be like Moshe, but maybe others. So they said maybe later on, not the case in the courts. Okay, there it says, wasn't just there, it's in Sefer Shemot, and they set up the court system in general, and they're told that they're gonna be with Moshe. What does it mean with Moshe? Like Moshe, in the sense that they won't have flawed lineage. So that's how we know, again, that the Sanhedrin, that Mum Ein Bach, is a reference to no blemishes in their lineage. So now they say, does that mean they don't put heads of communities or people who are disqualified? Okay, so now Shotrei HaRabim, we're going to assume means not just the people in the Sanhedrin, but really the people running the courts. Okay, that's the way they're seeming to define it. Now, it says here, anyone can do dinei mamonot, just not dinei nefashot, not capital cases, but monetary cases, anyone can do. The Hevinamba, and they questioned, Hakol Latuyemai, what does it mean, Hakol, everyone? What does that include? Amar Rav Yehuda Latuyemamzel. So here you see even Mamzerim could have been. So this doesn't show that you have unflawed lineage. To which they answer, Amar Baye b'Yerushalayim. Specifically in Jerusalem, they were careful only to have people with not flawed lineage. V'chein Tanei Rav Shimon bar Zera b'Kiddushin de Levi b'Yerushalayim. Okay, he also brought it right that said this is specifically in Jerusalem. There they had a higher standard for all of their judges, and therefore anyone being a judge in any of these places would end up being with unflawed lineage. But anywhere else, only if it was capital cases, not in monetary cases. We're going to go back to this issue of people arguing and what happens when they argue. So the people who collected the money for charity can marry anybody. So my time, what's the reason? Because they fight with people in general. How do we know they fight with people? Because, okay, different than now we do nowadays, we don't really force people to give charity, but in those days, you were allowed to force people to give charity. You could be what's called mimashken alat tzedakah. You could forcibly take a collateral from someone who hasn't given their charity. So they would force people to give charity. And even on Erev Shabbat, when people are busy and have a million things to do, you could come in and forcibly give charity. It was actually funny when I was preparing this daf, somebody called me, a telemarketer, asking for charity. And I was thinking it was exactly this about the, people calling you and pushing you to give charity. We usually cringe when we do that, like, leave me alone, who are you? But I got one of these phone calls from some random organization saying, we just sent you our campaign, please come support us. And, I was thinking exactly about this, about forcing people to give charity. Anyway, you could do that. And therefore, they were the least likable people, just like I wasn't so happy this telemarketer bothered me in the middle of my preparation for the daf. I guess I probably shouldn't have answered the phone, but once in a while you see a number you don't know and it might be something important. So I answered the phone and it was annoying to me, right? So people, these guys would come to their door, they'd get annoyed, then they'd start fighting with them. And what does that mean? Well, if people fight with them and get angry with them, over time, people will start checking into their background and saying, oh, look, this guy is, problematic lineage. So again, if there really was a problem, everyone would know. Now we're going to talk about people. Now, this is a very big, important issue. There's something called srara, which is some sort of job that requires some sort of, again, it's very hard to define this word, authority over other people. Okay, like a public position. And it's known, it comes from the king. It's supposed to come from among your brothers. From there, they learn that a convert who doesn't come from among your brothers because he wasn't born Jewish can't have roles of srara. Okay, this has all sorts of ramifications, which again, unclear exactly where to draw the line. Okay, like some people say, a convert shouldn't be president of a shul, because that's a srara position. Other people say, that's not srara, okay? Right? This is also, by the way, an issue with female rabbis. Also, the srara issue comes up because women aren't supposed to have srara also from the king. King is male. And therefore, again, what do you define? Is a rabbi of a shul srara, right? I'm not going to take a side on this issue. I'm just going to say that this is where these issues come from. So now we have a story. So Rav Ad bar Ava goes to an inn, or his landlord or something, his innkeeper was a convert. And we're going to see he was actually the son of converts. Now, there's a fight going on between this son of a convert and Rabbi. I want to be in charge of the city. I want to be the guy in charge of the city. Notice the word sraruta. I want to be the one in charge of the city. After the Kametu Rav Yosef. So they go before Rav Yosef. Now remember, the story started, he was the innkeeper of Rav Ad bar Ava. He's going to come in a minute, the Rav Ad bar Ava. So first they go to Rav Yosef. Tanina, it says in the Braita, Som tasim alecha melech mikerav achecha. What does it say, mikerav achecha? Kol mesimot she'ata misim. Anyone you're going to put in charge, Eino lo yeh ela mikerav achecha, should only be from among your brothers. So he basically says, sorry to the convert, the son of converts, but you can't do this. To which Rav Ad bar Ava says, wait a minute. Amarle Rav Ad bar Ava, with the perfect compromise solution, says, but wait, ta'afilu imomi Yisrael, even if his mother's Jewish, because he was the son of a convert, but his mother was Jewish. So he says, Amarle, well, imomi Yisrael mikerav achecha krina be. Says, well, imomi Yisrael, then already he's considered from among our people. Hilkach, Rav Bevi, so now he says, therefore, Rav Bevi, degaver rabahu, li'ayin b'milei dishmaya, umar li'ayin b'milei demata. So he says, Rav Bevi, who's a big prominent person, let him be in charge of the Jewish-related issues, okay, or shamayim issues, I should say, not Jewish, but shamayim, like things that have to do with God, and mar li'ayin b'milei demata, and we'll give the son of the convert other authoritative position, but having to do with city type things. Okay, what the difference is, good question. Rashi says Milei Dishmaya are the ones who collect the tzedakah. They give out the tzedakah. They deal with the Torah readings and the haftorahs and things like that. I don't know exactly what that position is. And Milei Demata are other things that are needed for general public, right? Like street lights or, whatever it might be, roads, things like that. Put him in charge of that. Okay, so that's Rabbi Yosef's compromise after he hears that the mother was Jewish. Now they say, well, Amar Abaye comes and says, moral of the story, if you're going to host Talmidei Chachamim, you should invite people like Rav Ad bar Ava to Yadei Lemahapech Lebizchutim. Because if it weren't for Rav Ad bar Ava, he knew to try to go out to bat for you. Okay, but not everyone would do that. So find the right rabbi who's going to understand your situation and try to help you. Because if Rav Ad bar Ava hadn't said anything, then this convert would not have gotten that position that he wanted, or son of convert wouldn't have gotten the position that he wanted and really he was deserving of. Rabbi Zera metapel behu. Now we see different approaches. Rabbi Zera actually would allow converts to have these positions, and Rabbi Baravua also metapel behu. Okay, they both allowed this, but Ma'arava in Eretz Israel, in Israel, afilu reish kurei lo mukmei minai. They would even put him up as, I'm trying to remember the reish kurei, look at Rashi, right? Memuneh al hamidot, right? It's the people who, he wouldn't even let them be in charge of people who do the weighing, the weights, right? Checking up that everyone's not, being unfair about their weights when they're in their stores, that cheating on people. He wouldn't let a ger be in charge of something like that. In Israel, they wouldn't do this. And in Nehardea, they wouldn't even allow to be in charge of the irrigation. Okay, because these are public issues. Now, you can think of a few reasons why this public issue, and maybe this sugi is here for a reason, because it seems very unfair, right? Somebody converts, and it shouldn't be that they can't get these public positions. On the other hand, what do we see about public positions like the Gaba'et Tzedakah? That people scream at them and people curse them and it's always what they say about people in public positions, right? As soon as you make yourself public, you're open to a lot of criticism. And it could be, I'm just suggesting, and it just really dawned on me as I was teaching, that there's this concern of ostracizing the convert. And one of the ways of ostracizing the convert is to have people remind them that they're a convert, right? There's a whole big thing. You're not supposed to remind people that they're a convert. So this is actually tricky because in a sense, by not letting them have these positions, it's almost reminding them they're a convert. On the other hand, it could be it's protecting them from the negative criticism, which, as we all know, is beyond anyone's control. Nobody can make sure. I mean, there are people whose job it is, when you have a president or any public figure, to make sure that you're not going to get all this bad press and try to, somehow shush the people or get the media to kind of shift, and focus on something else instead of on all the bad things that people are slandering you about. But, right, crisis management and all that. But seriously, we all know that people are going to say things and people are going to, and maybe it's to protect the convert from that type of critique, especially if we talk about being a judge, also a judge. People always go out against judges. As soon as you walk out disgruntled from the court and you're going to go and start screaming about, who he is, and say, oh, well, he's a convert. What does he know about halacha, etc. So perhaps that's a way to understand this whole issue. Okay, now Rabbi Yossi Omer, Af Mishaya. Okay, now he goes and says, let's just go back because I don't quote the whole thing here. Okay, somebody signed on these documents, my time, they wouldn't allow people to sign until they had checked them out. In Tzipori specifically, or in Yeshana Shel Tzipori, some people say it's either old documents or maybe it's a place called Yeshana that was near Tzipori. Rabbi Chanina ben Tugimus. Okay, what did he say about even if you were in the court, the Istratia Shel Melech, you were part of the king's army. So what are we talking about here? This made the least sense. To which Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel b'chayalot shel Beit Aviv. We're talking about, or b'chaylot shel Beit Aviv. We're talking about the army of David HaMelech. Okay, then you knew the people had good lineage. Now, in a minute, we're going to say this doesn't make any sense. But Amar Rav Yosef Mikra, how do we know this? Because it says B'tiachsam b'tzava b'milchama. Okay, it says that they checked all the lineage. This is in, B'tiachsam. This is in Divrei Yamim chapter, Divrei Yamim Aleph chapter 7, it looks like to me. Kol ele b'nei asher rashi beit avot burim giborei chayil rashi hanisiim v'tiachasam mitzvah melchama misparam v'anasham, and then they said, right, they were all listed in the lineage, and here was how many they were. So now you see they all had their yichus organized. V'tama mayim, what was the reason? Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav, kedei shetehei zchutan u'zchut avot mesayatan. When they went out to war, they wanted to make sure that people had merits and they had their father's merits. Now, if they were sons of slaves or something, well, then you wouldn't have that. So they wanted to make sure everybody was, proper. Now they say, wait a minute, something doesn't make sense about this at all. When we have a list of the people in David's army, we have all these people who are Ha'ikat Selek Ha'amoni. Selek, who was from Ammon. That means he was an Ammonite. He wasn't Jewish at all. My lav da'ate Ammon does not that he was from Ammon. Lo diyate ba'Ammon. No, you could say he lived in Ammon, but not that he was born in the Ammonite. Va'ika Uriah Chiti. What about him? My lav da'ate b'chet. Didn't he come from the Chitim? Lo diyate b'chet. No, he just dwelled there. You want to say now, if you want to just say he lived in Gad, this is a different story about David HaMelech, that he took a crown from Gad, or from, I forget exactly where it was, but what happened was, right, it talks about Masechet Avodah Zarah, and it says that Ittai Gitti came, David wanted to use it, Ittai Gitti came and canceled it and said, this is no longer something we use for Avodah Zarah, and then David was able to actually benefit from it. So now they say, you can only do that. Who can be mevatel avodah zarah? Only someone who's an idol worshiper. So it must be he was an idol worshiper. He wasn't Jewish. And then again, how could you say everyone had yichus if it's clear it wasn't that he dwelled in God? So now we have a big problem. To which they answer, and furthermore, Amar Rav Yudah Amar Rav, 400 ילדים היו לו לדוד, וכולם בני יפת תורה היו, וכולם מסתפחים קומי ומגלים בלורית היו, וכולם יושבים בקרוניות של זהב, והיו מלכים בראשי גייסות, והן הם בעלי אגרופים של בית דוד. So now they say, David had all these children that he took. They were all beautiful. They had these Gentile haircuts, and they would sit in these beautiful golden chariots, and they would be in the front of the army. So now, and these were like David's henchmen, his fistmen, his thugs. So now they were also clearly Gentiles. So how do we reconcile this? How can we say the Chelope David were the ones who, and that's what the Mishnah is referring to, you have yichus, you can marry anybody, to which they answered, no. You got confused. Itagiti, maybe even the Ammoni and all those, maybe they really weren't living in Ammon, they really were Ammonites and all that. And you had all these children. They were Gentiles. They had a particular job. They would go out in the front. They had a good look to them, and they looked strong. And right, you usually think of Jews as, not as strong and tough guys. They would scare the enemy. And then you had the army. Those guys wouldn't fight. The fighters were all hityachasu. They all had yichus. But the others, no, they didn't. And that's the difference. They had two armies, basically. One was made up of all these other people, and one was specifically the army that would fight. Okay, with that, we finished our daf. So let's do a quick review of our daf. We started with the cuti lo yisa cutit. We brought another two explanations, Rabbi Akiva and in addition to Rabbi Ishmael, we explained the three different approaches in the Yeshom room, which we said was Rabbi Elazar. And then we brought two other historical things where we know something happened, that someone married someone, and because of that, we had an issue with the cuti community, and because of that, they couldn't marry each other. Then we went on to the next Mishnah about having to check, right, which seems to be probably for kahuna, okay, that we have to go and do this background check, right? How many generations, right, and how many people do we have to check? Depends whether she's come from a Kohen family or from a Levite or Israelite family. And then we had, like, the Mishnah is really only Rabbi Meir, and the rabbis disagree, or maybe the Mishnah only means if someone raises an issue, otherwise you don't really have to check. We explained why it was women and not the men, okay, and we talked about the difference in the culture of how people insult other people. We talked about also that if it's kohanim, then a bat kohen can really marry anyone, whereas a male kohen has much more limit in terms of who he can marry. And then we talked about we went through the whole list where they said, oh, these people don't need checking, these don't need checking, these don't need checking. And then we went through why each of those don't need to be checked. With that, we'll finish our daf, wishing everybody Shabbat Shalom and a Shabbat Tov.